Welcome to the U.S. Manufacturing Today podcast, your hub of information about the U.S. manufacturing and distribution industry. Brought to you by Veryable, the on-demand labor solution revitalizing and optimizing your operation, enabling just-in-time response to demand, more efficient production, and lower cost per unit. And now your host and head of reindustrialization at Veryable, Matt Merrin.
Welcome back to U.S. Manufacturing Today, the podcast powered by Veryable, where we talk with the leaders, innovators, and changemakers shaping the future of American industry, along with providing regular updates on the state of the industry, the changing landscape, policies, and more. In this episode of U.S. Manufacturing Today, we're joined by Merrin Muxlow, a principal at S Industrial and a seasoned leader in the manufacturing space with deep ties to the investment casting industry, the entire affiliated supply chain, and key industry groups like the Investment Casting Institute, the Southern California Manufacturers Association, and California Manufacturing Tech Association. As the manufacturing sector undergoes a major transformation from reshoring efforts to structural changes in global steel production, Merrin brings a grounded and visionary perspective on what it means for the American industrial base. It's a significant employer and contributes substantially to the economy, generating over $7 billion in casting value and directly supports over 40,000 U.S. jobs. Merrin, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, we're excited that you're here today to provide this interesting and very informed perspective on investment casting. So I would love to hear about the industry and what you're seeing today.
Great. Yeah, I could talk all day about investment casting. Investment casting, there's a funny quote where you're never a certain amount of feet from casting. It's basically a process by which metal goods are made. Strong ones, the ones that power everything. So think about things that are like a jet engine or the industrial machinery that's used to make sure that we have clean water or energy. Look at everything metal in the room that you're sitting in, and then think about anything that needs to be either high precision or something that like drives machines, right? That's likely made with a casting process. So he was talking about taking a red eye flying on an airplane, aerospace and defense, industrials, gas and turbine, like big machines is what casting makes, or intricate machines, like things that power the world, basically. That's what it is. So it's a key component of basically like our lives in general, something that I don't think a lot of people know so much about, the backstory for the objects that we use every day. But casting, we couldn't do it without casting.
It's one of the things that is so common in manufacturing, things that we use in our everyday lives. People don't know how they're made, or they feel that it's too distant. And so I'm really excited to dive into the topic with you. You know, we were talking a little bit about metal and casting in general, and people, myself included, have this broad overview of what it is, and they use words interchangeably. But there's been a lot of movement in the industry lately, a lot of consolidation, a lot of acquisitions, a lot of change, especially with tariffs and with other economic factors. I'm really interested, and I think most of our audience is probably as well, about the supply chain and what some of these ripple effects are and what we're seeing with tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, changes at the top, and how that can be make or break for these guys. What's the latest going on with those suppliers?
So that's it exactly. So the Investment Casting Institute has about 300 members. We're the technical and trade association for the investment casting industry. And so the boots on the ground of that industry are the foundries. So that's where they actually pour the molten metal, where they make the stuff. And it's super interesting for anybody that hasn't visited a foundry. It's like really cool to go see the stuff being made. And so those foundries supply the Boeing, the Northrop, the Caterpillar, the John Deere, et cetera. And so there are a couple of trends that we've been seeing. So first being foundries either closing or consolidating. And so that's in the past, I would say, 20 to 30 years. There are a few different reasons for that. There's first just generationally, where a lot of these companies, some people started it in whatever year, and now they're in their 60s, 70s, even 80s, and perhaps they don't have a child or that wants to take it over, or like a clear succession plan. And so what happens in that case is if people want to transition out, then they look at either selling or rolling them up together. Maybe another larger foundry buys it, as we've seen recently with Signacast and FS Precision. So that's one thing. So the other is just offshoring this production, which is a trend that's been happening for the past 30 plus years too. So sending casting production over to like China or India versus doing it domestically. And there are obviously like a whole host of problems with that. If you think about if you're making aerospace parts or parts for the DoD and outsourcing of IP, kind of one of the missions of the Investment Casting Institute is to make sure that people know, hey, there are businesses that do this domestically. There are plenty of them that have excellent capability, that have all of those years of like legacy institutional knowledge, which is frankly priceless for something like this. Like it's not really something you can just transition over to, oh, robots can do it all tomorrow, AI can do it. It's not that. So that's another trend. Another trend is something that is like tech saying that it's going to, quote, replace castings, but there's also this thing where it can definitely augment it, right? So that's where you see stuff like metal 3D printing or companies that will make the tooling for casting or that can make a production consumable that's within the casting process. Another is bigger companies bringing a foundry in-house. So a lot of these big like private aerospace companies or even others, there are plenty of others, that rather than say, okay, we don't want to necessarily outsource to these ABC suppliers because maybe that one guy might go out of business. Maybe they have to train up, have a bench of them. So they just bring the whole entire thing in-house and say, okay, we're going to have our own casting foundry. So that kind of consolidation has hurt the supply chain in general because then there's not that cross-pollination of, okay, who's adopting this new tech and how is that working for you? So if everything's siloed, it doesn't progress as fast or as much, and that's not good for the industry at large. That creates that old man in the sea problem, right? Where you have the one on the hook.
It's an excellent point to be made because we see it all the time in manufacturing, consolidation or vertical integration or however you describe it can lead to some of this components not being as well diversified, which kind of detracts from the industrial base where, that knowledge goes in-house or it becomes, kind of ownership of one organization and we don't have a diverse ecosystem as we could. You touched on a couple of other points that are really interesting. And we talk a lot on this show about reshoring and reindustrialization. To your point, what does the stronger domestic steel and casting capability mean for the broader goal of U.S. industrial independence?
We need to be able to make things and make things domestically, make things here, make things where the IP is not a risk. Also, make sure that we are self-sufficient as a country. And I think that I was talking with another person the other day, another woman that's in Georgia. We had this long conversation about that's what defines us as Americans is this idea of self-sufficiency. And so I think having a robust industrial base means that we're not at the mercy of other countries or supply chain disruption. Like we saw that during COVID, right? Where if you can't get one thing, then that's the one domino knocking over, where then there are like 6 different things down the line that are going to go wrong. And with manufacturing, where it's all plotted out, really interconnected, of not being able to get like one bracket can keep military airplanes on the ground for months. So we have to have that base, and it has to be a deep bench of small to mid-tier suppliers to that industrial base. That's what creates like that robust capability to be able to make things quickly. And I know that there's a lot of talk about, factories of the future and everything be digitized. And that's true. I think that's good. And a lot of the more future and tech forward foundries, like they're making big strides, which is great, but there just needs to be more. There's this company that's called Trump. It's like a laser company. And they make these big lasers for like metal additive machines. And one of the conversations that I always have when I go to their events, which are great, is some people are like, why can't we just have more foundries? Like, why do we have to reinvent the wheel, like 3D printing from the ground up? And so I think it's a good time to be a smaller, medium industrial supplier right now. Another issue that we didn't touch on before is this idea of talent. And that's something that is a top concern for a lot of these suppliers and why they're either thinking of selling or the bigger ones bringing things in-house. It's just like leadership development is just a major thing right now.
No, absolutely. We talk about it all the time at Veryable, and there's always a conversation in the broader manufacturing space about a shortage of workers. And we fundamentally believe that it's more about access to the types of businesses, the types of companies that you're talking about now, where that handoff and that knowledge transfer tend to take place and opening it up. And so legacy industries in particular, like what we're talking about today, how are they modernizing without losing what really makes them effective? It's kind of this old school process. You alluded to this one small component that can have the domino effect on the supply chain. There is rapid digital transformation, but, like most things, they're buzzwords. We hear that all the time. It's AI going to do this, or, at one point is blockchain going to do this? And it's kind of the fundamentals always stick around, So I guess the bottom line is, how do they modernize and do this the right way without losing what really makes them effective?
Everything in life comes down to that last mile of physical delivery. Even software runs on hardware. You have to have the physical stuff, the brackets, the turbines, the heat exchangers to run all those for the data centers. Casting makes this. To be able to get the talent into casting foundries, there are a couple of things that have to happen. So first, I think that American manufacturing is in the middle of kind of a renaissance, but it needs even like a heavier pivot rebrand. When I was in, middle school, every 12-year-old girl wanted to be a marine biologist. I think about that sometimes. It's super funny where was there just some famous marine biologist on TV or something? Why was that a shared goal? It's just a matter of marketing. Like, we really can emphasize the fun parts about manufacturing, which include making things, being creative in how you make things, having a physical object where you can point to that and say, that rocket is in the sky because of something that I did. That is cool. There's this perception, a lot of it, of legacy manufacturing, like that it's Mordor and it's going to give you cancer. And that's how my grandpa got the black lung. So no, thank you. I'm going to go be a software engineer. In touring a lot of these facilities, like, it's not that. It's not that at all. It's sure there's a component of like physical heavy lifting work. That's part of it. But that's something where a lot of facilities have robots doing that. So someone who's, 110-pound little person like me could still contribute to that. So it needs to be rebranded as something that can be really fun and cool and make things like that, like how it's made vibe. The second is resourcing it. So there are a lot of cool programs right now. There's the Navy Talent Development Pipeline, where they actively are throwing resources at getting people into doing this kind of work to be able to learn about it. Let's just be honest. If anybody who has worked in a metal casting foundry or who has worked in hands-on talent, even if they want to go become a mechanical engineer, they're going to be 10x better of one if they did that before. So there's that piece. There's another program that's through IACME, the Composites Institute, called Metal. The ICI actually has a nice partnership with them. And then there's another group called the Foundry Education Foundation. Steel Founders is heavily into that, where it's giving resources, meaning like money, how to make an apprenticeship program, all of that stuff for these mid-tier suppliers so that they can lift up that next generation of talent. It just starts earlier. It's also, kids need to be in wood shop when they're 8 and in metal shop when they're 10, and be able to change the oil on their car when they're 15, and just know how physical things are made. And the sooner that we can start doing that, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. You hit on a couple of other key points there, because I think there's this realization that it's a national security concern, not being able to make our own stuff. And it's not just the defense industrial base, it's that over-reliance. And where does it start? It probably starts in elementary and middle school. We had a great guest on a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about where the future skilled tradespeople are right now. And I think his guest said they're in the 8th grade. That's the future of where this is going. It's not something that can be turned overnight, just like it wasn't, sent out into globalization overnight. That's a 30-year and decades-long process where we debased ourselves and moved away from making things. And now we're awakening very quickly to the fact that key and critical industries don't have the type of pipeline for talent or the type of interest at large about how we make and build stuff. But that's how we've got to get back to it. And it's just one of those things that you look at anything and you can spot check almost any industry. Our shipbuilding capacity, for instance, is absolutely abysmal. You look at China and they're building ships at military grade, even their commercial vessels. And so when you think about that type of national importance behind what we do and how foundational it is, not only to our defense, but our survival and prosperity in the future, it's pretty critical. So those are really great points.
I mean, if you think about it, like, the US is a young country. China is an old culture, as is like India. If you want to think of like the scale of if each country culture was like a human being, like how old they would be, I feel like the United States would be something like an older teenager. And so perhaps not necessarily a lot of long-term thinking. And perhaps also it's if you have 1,000-year plan of like, we need to bake this into our culture, that we are self-sufficient, that we make things, that we know how to make things like physical objects in real space. We just have to do that. I think there was a huge shift. I talk about it with my parents often, like the generation right after them, where it's, no, nobody wants to go do a job like that. You need to go be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, something where like you can sit in an office. And then ironically, it's like AI replacing those jobs the first, which is not, I think, anything that anybody could have predicted. And like, we all have to have a body. We all have to eat. Like, we all want to go visit our families somewhere, maybe drive a car, fly an airplane. And so considering careers that facilitate those things, and those careers are fun and cool.
You make a really great point. I think about my grandparents when, you kind of mentioned that societal shift over the past several decades. My grandfather was a classic greatest generation profile, grew up in a small rural town, served in World War II, came back, worked at a manufacturing facility for his whole life, made great pay, and retired. And the reason he retired is because it was offshore. His plant was offshored. And so we've seen that play out over the course of decades. And so there's this great urgency to it. And, what people like you are highlighting, it's really important. And it's got to be a conscious decision by people, not only in the industry, but, the country at large. And so that's really the next step for all of this in terms of the reindustrialization movement. Pivoting now a little bit, I wanted to highlight some of the associations that you're part of and some of the organizations, because that's really where a lot of the critical work gets done, and the part of the country that you're in. We like to highlight from where guests are from. And so we'll start maybe there, and then please tell us about, the Investment Casting Institute and others. But California isn't always the first place people think of when they hear manufacturing, but there's a rich ecosystem there. It actually, if I remember correctly, has the most manufacturing jobs in the country by way of, being innovative and being the largest state in the country. But would love to get what the latest is on that.
I sit on the Small Medium Manufacturers Committee for the California Manufacturing and Technology Association. California has a robust, wonderful manufacturing economy where I think a lot of people don't realize. I'm in San Diego in Southern California. And part of that, I think, is those types of organizations, like the trade organizations, are the connective tissue in being able to transfer knowledge. It's not just, networking or whatever else. It's you can figure out like what's working and what's not working. Plus, design and engineering can sit right next to manufacturing, which I think is key for anything, like especially for technological advances. So it's good that we have the tech ecosystem, Silicon Valley. There are a bunch of these companies popping up that are in the hardware space or tech for manufacturing. And when you have a local commons like that, it just raises everything so much faster, which we would love to see that kind of extend to the rest of the country. That would be great. And California also has a lot of aerospace stuff. And a lot of those aerospace companies have really good apprenticeship programs. And so that's something that could be a lesson as well. And so that's something that we're trying to bake in with the ICI, with the Investment Casting Institute as well, is often it's in places where you wouldn't necessarily expect. And sometimes it is that Foundry corridor that's like Indiana, Ohio, et cetera. That's the main belt for casting in the US. But really, there are castings and places that use castings and machine shops and everywhere. And the more of them that we can have, the better off we all are. I think that's an often overlooked opportunity.
Right, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of talk in the news about companies investing in the United States, and we kind of talk about these in terms of numbers, X amount of billions of dollars being invested by this company, and the supply chain and everything that's adjacent to it sometimes is an afterthought. I saw recently, I believe it's Hyundai building a facility, and they had to build a foundry next to it, if I recall correctly, in Louisiana. So that type of thinking, it just doesn't seem to pop up, but I'm sure it catches your eye when they're talking about building the foundry and some of the supply chain and critical material around it.
That's actually a really interesting piece. That goes back to building the wheel, like reinventing the wheel or like building it from scratch, right? Is because there aren't enough to be able to necessarily acquire them. And a lot of them go in, okay, we can build our own, and then not really realizing that is extraordinarily hard. And that there's like a bunch of institutional knowledge that would need to transfer. And that there are plenty of foundries that would be wanting to do that work, perhaps in other parts of the country, just being able to know about it. And the more that the industrial base can talk with and to each other, the better off we will be, like the less siloed. That's why trade organizations are so important, is because that's where those conversations are taking place. Somebody that's from, I don't know, Japan or Korea or coming over, oh, where can I build this? That's how you get to know where those things are if you're Hyundai. The other funny thing about Hyundai, I think there was that news piece about the robots, but then like they own the robot company. So it's like, they're just like buying the robots from themselves.
Yeah, all this works is it's always, there's something kind of under the layer of it. But I think to your point, those local national trade associations or group associations help bridge the gap between policy and workforce and the day-to-day operations of what companies actually do. So it's critical work. Tell us more about the Investment Casting Institute in particular. I know that's something that you work with and are very passionate about. How many members and who all do they represent?
So ICI, we've got about 300 members. It's a global organization. It's open to really anybody within the investment casting supply chain. So it's foundries, those that are actually doing the casting, suppliers to foundries, and then we now have a new category of member that's customer member. And so the idea of a customer member, that would be something like a Caterpillar, where they are sourcing castings from a variety of different foundries, or maybe building up their own internal R&D to have this kind of a casting process. We do have a few members that are doing that. And we do have confidential members. So it's something that if you are building that bench, building that base, but you don't want your name splashed as, yes, we're doing that, that's an option as well, just for the technical knowledge. And it's an interesting one. There are so many things because it's a physical world, right? So we went and toured recently a facility that's up in LA. It's Finico. And the air here is dry in Southern California. So the shells that are on the outside of the casting pattern, the wax pattern, those dry completely differently versus somewhere. Another one that I toured was Bimac in Ohio, where they have a bunch of fans going. So it's entirely based on climate. And then you have to think about like the air conditioning or climate control if you need it. And then those components are made via casting. So it's like this whole circular thing when you think about it. And just getting people to think about how does this actually function in the physical world is what I'm trying to put out into the world with all of my work, as is the ICI, where those parts on an airplane are critical components and you can't wait for them. They can't be something where it's, okay, we can get that for you in 3 months, or maybe let's just try to 3D print it and see if that works. Just in returning to that whole idea of workforce, talent, the next generation being in the 8th grade. There are a lot of organizations doing really good work around that now. And one of them is the Steel Founders Society. They run a competition called Cast in Steel, where the students make swords, like Lord of the Rings, intricate swords. I think it's actually on regular TV now for the Forged in Fire as a TV show. We need more of those things for people being able to see how fun and interesting and cool it is to design and make something, like from start to finish. Have an idea of what a physical thing will be, and then actually go out and make that. A lot of groups are doing a really good job of doing that. The Metal Boot Camps, Steel Founders Society among them.
To that point, where do you see momentum on the workforce front, but where are we really stuck right now? I think that would be a really great area to highlight, because there are, just like you said, those things that are starting to appeal to younger generations and people that are, looking at manufacturing as a career track where maybe 10, 20 years ago they weren't. Are most of the industry kind of stuck right now?
There's like a push and pull. So ICI had a symposium, it was last week, called Advanced Manufacturing for Investment Casting. We had a couple of really good panels, one that was on workforce and talent. People are stuck on whose responsibility is this? So the bigger companies, say you're like Safran or Boeing or a bigger company like this, you obviously want the people, or even a second tier if you're Howmet Aerospace underneath that. Those companies need to be saying, we need this in terms of skill set. That's what we're looking for. Even I saw Palantir is they want like high schoolers now. That's, I think, like it's a spitball, but like, why not? Why not try that? I think it's Lockheed has a nice apprenticeship program as well, where it's, if you want to get the people in, you have to start getting them younger. You have to start actively knowing what you want the skill set to be, and then figuring out how do they acquire that skill set, either through your own company internally or by working with a university, a community college, a trade association, a program like Metal or Steel Founders, to be able to have the people not only acquire those skills, but acquire the interest to acquire those skills. I think it's really reductive and dumb when people say, oh, everybody just wants to be an influencer, everybody just wants to be on Instagram. That's false. Like, kids are smart, and especially this new generation, they're smarter than us. They want to go do interesting things, but they need to know how to do that because they are kids.
Right. No, you bring up a really interesting point, and something we see at Veryable all the time is we'll hear groups say there's not a talent pipeline to this, or there is a skilled worker shortage. And they'll think that our platform or, the larger manufacturing movement, whatever you want to call it, is just going to provide this and serve it up. Or an association is just going to provide it and serve it up. And usually it's, take a look in the mirror. You're the ones that have the need. You have to invest. You have to build this yourself. And I've heard it from associations across the country where that's a common thing, not just manufacturing businesses, but all businesses, because it's very easy to say they just want to be influencers. They want to have, 10 years ago, it was a YouTube channel, or they want to be famous, which is also something that comes up. And my experience is no, they want access to work and fast pay and being in a merit-based system where they're learning something, they're getting great feedback, and they know that they're building something important because they are smart and they want to be part of something like this. So to your point, I think that's really spot on. It's what we see a lot of the times where people say, where are the workers? And it's like, what are you doing to bring the exact type of worker to your organization?
Yeah, that's it exactly. And firstly, there's bringing the person into your organization. The second thing is you have to be able to grow your own stars, like within your own organization. So it's not just an outsourced responsibility of let's just acquire this person and this skill set. There's also a piece of, no, you have to develop that person as well. And I think that there's a little bit of a gap there right now in terms of internal talent development. We had a panelist, John Inwiller, his company is called AIT Business Solutions at AM for IC. And he's he runs programs like this. He's done it for other bigger organizations also, and now is having one that's geared towards small and mid-sized suppliers, because there's such a need for that, where it's, okay, we have some people who are excited to build and make things, but how do we make sure that they have buy-in, that they find meaning, that they gel as a group, and that actually makes our company be profitable, where they can share in that. And that's what this next generation of people, I'm an old millennial, but doesn't everybody want that? They want a job where it's they feel like they're doing something good for society. They feel valued. They feel purposeful, feel part of a team. And so if people don't feel that way, then they're just not going to go work in manufacturing. They're going to go work in tech or something like that. So maybe that's part of the issue as well.
Right. No, they've got to see that path in manufacturing, and they can go work in tech, but I don't know how much fulfillment they'll get out of it. It's as much as making something with your hands, or what we hear oftentimes from guests and people in the industry and organizations like yours. The fulfillment of it is so exciting for people who live it and do it every day on the ground. And build it from the ground up. And so just final thoughts, what's your call to action for the American manufacturing community today? If there's something that is missing or specifically for the industry, what are your thoughts on that?
What's our 1,000-year plan, man? How do we become an old culture? How do we become a culture where people truly are self-sufficient, knowing how to make things? It starts with collaborating with each other, firstly. It starts with having this connective tissue of really sound and respected and attended trade organizations, trade events, because that really is where it's not threatening in a way, right? That's where you can go and have industry collaborate. So a lot more people need to be joining a trade, technical or a trade association. A lot more companies, especially the big dogs, need to be joining those. That's how they can get the talent. That's how they can get access to the innovation. That's how they can become part of that connective tissue where we all lift up together. And 1,000-year plan starts with, there's this saying that I love. I think it's the philosopher Seneca. I might have to fact check myself on that, but society grows great when old men plant trees in whose shade they know they will not sit.
Absolutely. That's, I think, we talk about it, 1,000-year American empire for all of our industry and what we want to do and really build for the future. It's something that I hope that we're finding the way back to, and something that it sounds like your organization is very involved in. Where can our listeners go to find out more about you and your efforts?
So in terms of more about the Investment Casting Institute, we are investmentcastinginstitute.org. I am Merrin Muxlow. I'm probably the only one with that strange name. Go ahead and look me up and get in touch. And then I can put you in touch with any of these other organizations that I'm affiliated with as well.
That's awesome. Merrin, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
To stay ahead of the curve and to help plan your strategy, please check out our website at variableops.com and under the resources section titled Trump 2.0, where you can see the framework around upcoming policies and how they will impact you. If you're on socials, give us a follow on LinkedIn, X, or Instagram. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please feel free to follow the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube, and leave us a rating, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you again for joining us and learning more about how you can make your way.